Should we be rethinking the way we do elections? This week on Download This Show, the Aussie company rolling out blockchain election technology all around the world. How does it work? And more importantly, can it really be trusted? Plus, can you really use your music taste to sell you fashion? All of that and the latest on My Health Record and Facebook and a whole lot more. This is your guide to the week in media, technology and culture. My name is Marc Fennell and welcome to Download This Show. Horizon State is an Australian startup that has been spending a lot of the last couple of years thinking about this. It's trying to use blockchain technology to provide secure online voting in not just elections, but all manner of democratic processes. And it's about to be tested in Indonesia. And Jamie Skeller from Horizon State joins us now. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Thanks, mate. Good to be here.
So let's just start with blockchain, right? It is like the buzzword du jour. It gets used all the time. For people that have never heard of it before, what the hell is it?
In simple terms, it doesn't actually tell you a lot, but in simple terms, what we're talking about is a distributed and decentralized and synchronized database, a kind of record book, a kind of ledger. But when this is not owned by any one party or any one individual or any one company or organization, then you can do quite powerful things with it. So if we think about currency as an example, the most obvious application, the most well understood one right now is Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And this enables us to transact in a peer-to-peer fashion without middlemen, without any intermediaries, while still having full trust in that transaction.
So how does that intersect with your business, which is elections? How do you make that technology work in the very fraught world of politics?
Well, if you think, again, using the sort of Bitcoin analogy, what that transaction represents, when I transact with you and I send you a fraction of a Bitcoin, that transaction is perfectly accountable, it's perfectly transparent, it's immutable, it's irreversible, it's post-unforgeable. And so these are all great properties for a vote or a voting system. And so in effect, we're retrofitting transactions on blockchain technology to represent votes to create what is in effect an unhackable record of the result.
Trust in elections is a very precarious thing, particularly now. So how do you make this particular technology unhackable? And also in doing so, not act as a giant red rag to a hacker.
Well, it's worth noting that what we're doing isn't just for elections. So voting and democratic processes come in all shapes and sizes and forms, everything from AGMs through to membership engagement, council engagement with residents, so non-electoral stuff. But look, I guess to try and explain it concisely, the explanation that I often give to try and articulate how this is secure is again to use the cryptocurrency analogy. Now, if I wanted to exchange $5 worth of value with you, whatever that might be, but I didn't want to use a bank, but I would still kind of like some assurance that the transaction is what we say it is for I guess, future consideration, we might gather up hundreds or even thousands of our friends and associates, trusted people, and we tell them to bring a record book and a pen, and they witness this transaction of value between us. They note the time, they note the two parties, they verify that the signatures are correct, the amount, the $5 worth of value, and then everybody goes back home. Some of them live around the corner, but some of them live all the way on the opposite side of the world. Now, if you wanted to go and try and artificially change that transaction, that $5 worth of value. And so, of course, this has direct relationships to votes for us as well. If you wanted to try and change someone's vote, you would kind of need to be breaking into every one of their houses around the world simultaneously and changing that line item in the record book all at once simultaneously. And so...
there's a heist movie I want to see.
Exactly. And so, putting my computer scientist hat on, we can say that this is incredibly improbable, but in layman's terms, this is an impossible feat. And so that, at a very simple and technically imperfect level, is how it works. But it's a good sort of foot in the door to start reading more.
So your system's about to be tested in Indonesia. Tell me what's about to happen there.
So we've partnered with an organisation called the NU. I won't even try and pronounce the unabbreviated version because I'll butcher it. But this is a socio-religious organisation, about 96 million members, incredibly progressive, doing great work in the region. And so this is going to be utilised by their membership to improve the quality of collaborative decision-making processes. It'll be about narrowing the gap between member and organising body and helping them have a more frequent dialogue, an improved dialogue, which, comes in the form of votes. But there are other tools we're building for them as well. Community initiatives, fundraising, these kinds of things.
So at the moment, there are functions around the world that involve voting that aren't necessarily full electoral roll sort of situations. But are there examples of countries that have demonstrated an interest in it for that purpose, for actual elections?
Well, look, Estonia has already been running votes online since 2005. Now, it doesn't use blockchain technology, so there is, I guess, a healthy amount of skepticism. But so far, it's run pretty much flawlessly for them. This is really the next evolution of that, where I think we can start to see some broad adoption of this technology on a global scale, because now voting in a decentralized, remote fashion becomes far more trustworthy. And this has a whole lot of other really positive knock-on effects as well. When you enable internet voting, it means that you can increase participation in places like the United States, because all of a sudden having your say is more convenient.
Yeah.
In developing nations, it means that people are kept safer, because sometimes going to these points of polling can be life-threatening sort of ordeals. And so a huge number of really positive knock-on effects socially, but also from a commercial perspective as well. I mean, if we think about the same-sex marriage plebiscite here in Australia costing us as taxpayers in the vicinity of 120 million, we might have been able to run that for less than 1 million. We could have run it 4 times as fast and perfectly securely, whereas we saw postal votes left out in the rain, we saw postal votes delivered to the wrong places, and so inherently insecure despite its paper-based nature.
I'm curious about if we were to take the electoral situation, right? Currently, we all obviously rock up, we collect our sausage, but there's an identity factor to that where somebody has to cite you. How do you ensure that identities can be verified in this system? Let's assume we're plugging it into something equivalent to an electoral system. How would you go about making that work?
So identity for us changes customer to customer. It's pretty much the one piece of the puzzle which is always fluid, because if we are implementing this technology for an enterprise, they might already have an established sort of eligibility list, some kind of staff list, and so that's very simple. And maybe the authentication mechanisms for that organisation are simply a username and password. Sweet, too easy. For electoral processes, things get much trickier. But this isn't necessarily a complete cut away from analog. This isn't a hard switch, so to speak. There'll be a progression here. And so we are in talks with a government over in Europe now about facilitating the 2019 federal election. But in this instance, in the first instance at least, people won't be voting from their pockets remotely. Instead, we'll be standing up electronic voting machines. But unlike the US versions, they don't store votes locally. They cast to a blockchain. And so the process of ID verification will remain unchanged in this case. People will go to the polling station, they'll be identified with their government ID, and they'll place a vote. But instead of on paper, it's through a digital machine. And then moving forward, we'll start to branch out and enable remote ID verification through smart devices and allow people to participate remotely.
With the Sumatran example that you're about to embark on in the next couple of weeks, what are the things that most concern them about this?
Look, I think, and I don't want to say anything too far out of place, but I guess the interesting equation for us taking this technology to places like Indonesia and elsewhere is that the appetite varies dramatically based on individual perception and how far they lean as an actor in regards to good or bad in that particular jurisdiction. And so in developed nations, we're relatively complacent, and so the desire for this technology mightn't necessarily be as high. In developing nations where they stand to gain the most from it, well, at least the people stand to gain the most from it. Sometimes it's not something that is so desired by the organising body or the government in question, because maybe the way things that have operated at the moment aren't entirely above board, and they don't necessarily want to change that. And so we're having some really interesting conversations and some sensitive conversations in various places, depending on their economic strength, depending on how stable their democracy is, all these sorts of factors.
So let's say there are certain governments and organisations that are scared of a technology that is harder for them to rig.
Yeah, I guess we can say it as simply as that. But I do believe that give it 5 to 10 years and any government or any party or any politician that is outright rejecting the use of this kind of technology, doesn't even need to be ours. I think as long as this happens, we win. I mean, this is a commercial venture for us, but it's also a philosophical one. But in 5 to 10 years, the rejection of this kind of technology will effectively be a proclamation of corruption, because there is no reason whatsoever that you wouldn't want to make your democratic process more secure.
In any democratic system, be it a country or an annual general meeting, there's the client, which is the business in this instance that would hire you, but then there's all the other stakeholders, which would just be people that are voting. How do you convince the users, the voters in this instance, that you're an impartial product in that sense?
So not only is the ledger, the record of the result, perfectly auditable by anybody, any member of the public, but the technology itself that facilitates these transactions is also open source in nature. It's auditable by anybody. You can have a look at it yourself. If you can't read or write code, then you can employ people that do to audit that. And so there's transparency at every level. Every piece of this puzzle is far more accountable, far more transparent than any system before it.
And how does the auditability of it intersect with something like the principle of a private vote? How do you make those two concepts sit together?
So anonymity is actually relatively easy to achieve. We thought this was going to be a big hurdle, but in fact it's not. Using current public chains, we can perform things such as double hashing to make sure that's the case. But there's also various technologies being built into some of these public blockchains now, which are inherently more anonymous from the get-go, which includes something called ZK snarks. It means zero knowledge proofs. It's just cryptographic magic, basically, which basically provides assurance.
I'm going to need more than that.
Yeah.
Even though I probably won't understand it, I'll probably need more than that.
So there's through cryptographic encryption, we're able to establish, for example, that a transaction was valid and real and signed for without actually having any knowledge of who the person who signed it was. But the technology itself allows for that appreciation, a zero knowledge proof. It's a deep subject matter, blockchains, and when we're talking about elliptical curve, signature algorithms, we're talking about proof of work concepts, we're talking about cryptography, we're talking about distributed systems. I don't think there's anybody in the world that's actually an expert on blockchain end to end, because it is so broad and so deep at every single one of these verticals.
Isn't that a business problem?
Like, I think it's a slowly but surely kind of process. The analogy I use is that we're kind of at the internet of 1992, 1994 in respect to blockchain. So there's a long way to go for mass adoption. But when we get there, it's almost taken for granted in the sense that you and I, this is a podcast, we browse websites, but we probably don't have a terrific idea about TCP/IP or how it works, but we just know that it works. It's demonstrated to us. And so again, this isn't about saying, right, next year everybody's voting digitally. There'll still be polling stations. There'll still be postal votes. But for every polling station that we don't need to stand up, we save money, we create efficiency, and we improve the overall legitimacy of result. And same thing for postal votes. And so over time, we hope to be able to roll this out and have, the maximum possible penetration in any electoral process.
Jamie Skeller from Horizon State. You are a fascinating man to talk to.
Thanks, mate.
Jamie Skeller there from Horizon State. And a very big thank you to our panellists this week. Jeremy Kirk, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Ep 2, didn't scare you off?
Nope.
I should have worn my special fangs. That'll do it next time. Ariel Bogle, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks, Mark.
Hey, if you are interested in some of that stuff we were talking about earlier with regards to Russia and elections, can I recommend a fantastic podcast that comes out of ABC News called Russia If You're Listening? It is presented by Matt Bevan. It is all about the intersection between the Trump administration and the Russians, and there is a really phenomenal episode about that troll factory that Jeremy was talking about earlier. And with that, I will leave you. My name's Marc Fennell, and thank you for listening to another episode of Download This Show.